My name is David Orban, and I am very glad to have all of you following the show. Before we start, I want to remind you that even if we are live, you can always watch past episodes of Searching for the Question live, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And of course, on YouTube, you can also subscribe to the channel. We also have a Discord community, and you are welcome to join there in order to continue the conversations around the themes that we cover. And finally, if you find the show valuable, you are welcome to become a fan, a supporter, a sponsor, or a benefactor on Patreon at patreon.com/David Orban. Today's guest is Michel Bauwens, and Michel and I have been communicating and conversing in various ways for a few years. Michel is a Belgian peer-to-peer theorist and a very prolific writer, researcher on the subject of technology, culture, and business innovation. Peer-to-peer theory is a new and emerging field, and his inclusive home for conducting the research is the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, where the collaboration in exploring peer production and the reason why the commons matter is very, very active. Now, the reasons why peer-to-peer and the commons matter will be the heart of our conversation. And I believe it is today an especially important subject. Today, during the pandemic, and as we start to try to understand what the world should look like after it, we need really to embrace new kinds of thinking. And I fully believe that Michel represents an important contribution to this new kind of thinking. So, Michel, welcome to Searching for the Question Live.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really honored. I've also been following your work, and so I'm kind of happy that this is happening here.
So one wonderful component of your life is that you are bicontinental. You spend this is where we are in Bergamo now, and you are in Belgium during the winter, but summertime you migrate, if I understand. And right now we are jumping over to Chiang Mai, where you are in Thailand, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Chiang Mai is in northern Thailand, close to the what is the end of the Tibetan-Burman plateau. So it's kind of the end of the Himalayas. We're not very high anymore. It's about 700 meters. But it's kind of a town that is a bit famous. It's called the Rose of the North. It's a bit like, Bruges and Ghent in the Middle Ages. It has, hundreds of monasteries, and it has a wall So it has a medieval city center. And paradoxically, it has become the capital of digital nomads, at least until COVID came along. So there is a Facebook group with 25,000 digital nomads that exchange tips with each other about living here. So there's this whole circuit of people that go to Medellin and Tenerife and different places because these are the people who are independent of place and they can work on their computers. And so the quality of life here is quite exceptional.
And I learned about Chiang Mai exactly through that because now I am happily stuck in my wonderful home in Italy and have been for the past 7 months. But before I would indeed travel a lot, and just like you, I can work anywhere or wherever the next conference is. And there is a website called the Nomad List, and the Nomad List ranks the places for the best overall quality across many different indicators. And
Right.
Chiang Mai, for me, was also surprising because I didn't know about it at the top, at least at the time. You discovered it on your own, independently from the digital nomad wave, or even before.
Yes, I went on a trip and I met somebody, as often happens around here, and so I was basically kidnapped and ended up wanted to live here because it's if you're European, this is a very rich place in terms of contrast, and the typical thing about this country is it was never colonized, so it has kept much more of its kind of original culture and ways of life, ways of thinking that even the neighbors would have because they've been colonized by France or Britain. So that makes the country a bit unique. So the kind of mix of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, when the three are alive. So it's not like in Italy where you can find, beautiful medieval cities, but outside of the mountains, maybe in the south of Italy, you won't find people who still live and think that way. And so that's what makes the place attractive, and the slow pace of life, the extraordinary level of friendliness in the culture, and so in a certain way, because if you can earn your money through your digital work, then the arbitrage between the earning and the cost of living here is advantageous.
Yes.
For people like me. And so it's used by these digital nomads as a way to obtain more freedom because, for example, we have people here, or used to have, I don't know if they're still here, but from the Mozilla Foundation, they were making about $4,000 a month, but only spending 1,000. So that means that every month you're working, you can put 3,000 aside. And what then allows them to, work on their open source projects of their own choosing. And the same happened with crypto. I actually went to a meeting where a crypto person called Griff Green, if I remember it correctly, said the problem in Chiang Mai is that we cannot find people who want to work for money. Of course, that's true in that environment. It wouldn't be true for everyone, but in that environment, because so many people have been successful, early investors in Bitcoin and Ethereum, so there is here a group of people that basically practices what I study, which is passionate peer production, right? Because they're kind of like a labor aristocracy. And I've always been a big fan of this notion. So, for example, if you look at the history of the labor movement in the 19th century, that wasn't done by the landless peasants who came in the city and were completely lost. It came because of the guild workers that still had a historical memory of self-organization. And so they were the ones behind the unions and all these popular movements because they were educated, they had higher wages. So I think today there's something similar going on with the people in the crypto world and they have their kind of libertarian, egalitarian philosophy. And so once they kind of free themselves from, the struggle for income, they start really implementing a lot of ideas that other people cannot afford to implement because they're too busy surviving. You see what I mean?
And one of the reasons why that is so beautiful is because money by itself stops being a reason for a project to be attractive.
Exactly.
And eliminating that leverage, you can better compare projects for their positive impact on society and the world.
Yeah.
And that is the talent accruing to the better projects out of those parameters rather than the financial incentive.
Just yesterday, I saw this thing called Mega Game, I think, a Mega Fam, which is like a new blockchain kind of network for workers who are organized in a guild. I think it's called the Raid Guild. And so I very much believe in these things. Like we have the territorial level, we have the nation state level. And right now, what we need is planetary guilds. We need people to organize at a meta local level. Not against the local, because it's very important to be in a healthy environment and to have local food and all of that. That's important. But in terms of knowledge, we have to scale. And so the idea of a planetary guild is something that appeals a lot to me because it creates this third level, transnational, translocal, which is not capital. So we're not talking about global capital, and we're not talking about global state.
Yeah.
We're talking about global civic entrepreneurship in a way, right? These are not projects that aim primarily to make money. They are mission oriented, purpose driven, and so they have high ethical goals, and because they're highly evolved technically, they're not weak. They're actually a strong, faction in the world. So I find that interesting in terms of historical actors at this moment.
Let's go there and let's look at that. But before we do that, I would like to ask you two things. One, to tell us a little bit about your personal journey of how did you discover and decided that you want to embrace this particular field of study. And the second, if you don't mind, to draw a short historical arch so that those viewers that are not familiar with the topic of the commons and peer-to-peer production can have a better context and understanding of how it evolved and how we are where we are today. So why don't you tell us about yourself first?
Yeah. Okay, I'll be kind of brief about my own journey because I want to talk about the other thing. But briefly, I had a big burnout in my mid 40s. That was like in the mid 90s. And at the same time, I was really seeing that, all the alarm bells were going off, in terms of planetary boundaries, peak resources, climate change. And at the same time, there was a revival in the mid 90s of civic movements, the anti-globalization movements, the Zapatistas. And I was working, I was an internet entrepreneur. And after my burnout, I decided I became a strategy director for a large telco in Belgium. But I just didn't like it anymore. I said, these people who only think about the short term, about the next 3 months, and don't care what is happening to the planet. And also internally, I felt the kind of internal psyche of the corporations was getting very pressured, very stress driven, and so kind of felt, I have to get out of here. And so I took a 2-year sabbatical, and I studied historical transitions. So I wanted to know, okay, if we want to change today, and given that the communist project failed, what do we do today? How do we change society? And I looked at different these transition moments, like the end of the Roman Empire, the age of revolutions in the 18th century, and I came out with a particular vision, which is basically answering now your second question. So we could look at history as kind of subject to waves. So it's actually called wave pulse theory technically. And so imagine this: you have a particular form of class society.
Can you repeat wave what?
Wave pulse. So
Okay.
imagine a wave, and then it goes over the top, and then it has a pulse which pushes it to go in the other direction. So it's kind of between polarities. And so you have the extractive polarity, the degradative polarity, and you have the regenerative polarity. So what tends to happen is that competing societies tend to overuse their territorial planetary boundaries because they're in a competitive game and they have to win. And at a certain moment, that no longer works. They have depleted their own area and they start weakening instead of getting stronger. And so you kind of have a collapse, some kind of breakdown, and then starts actually the other polarity, which is how are we going to solve what is happening to us? And what I'm claiming is that the commons, so the principle of a mutualization, is the key to the regenerative period. So I'll give you an example so you and your listeners can understand this. So I think it happened, for example, in the 12th century in Japan. So the whole country was degraded and deforested. Yeah. So what happens is basically the power structure changed. There was a religious reformation. And in that time, religions were the kind of vehicle for this, right? We have to be more harmonious with nature. We have to be more harmonious between people. So we need another type of regime. And so basically the emperor took power and controlled the land, and it functioned as a commons. It could no longer just be exploited. And so you would go back 3 centuries after that, and you would see that Japan is completely green, right? So in other words, the principle of the commons of mutualization is what healed the society. And of course, what's happening now is that Western humanity thought that we had escaped this cycle because of the efficiency of capitalism and new energies. And it turns out that the only thing we've done is kind of put it on hold for 4 centuries and arrived at a level of planetary overshoot. And so my claim is that we have to go now into a regenerative modality. And that means we have to honor the commons. So we have to develop a society and economics as if the commons mattered. And so this is not so easy because the West forgot about the commons, basically.
I have a remark and then two questions. I think an important consideration is that going into the second phase of regeneration is not at all guaranteed. It is necessary, but if we look at Easter Island, where we now presume a collapse was caused by ecological degradation, it wasn't just possible because having completely cut down their trees, the climate was such that the soil got eroded. And so even if at the time people could have realized that the trees were the key and wanted to plant them again, it would have taken just too long for the soil to regrow before the trees could have taken roots. And as a consequence, the Aborigines population of Easter Island went extinct. And a little bit is what we are running the risk of going against today. The planet is an island. There is no new continent whose resources we can despoil and deplete in order to support the unsustainable way of life of the stronger continent. And as a consequence, we have to wake up to the need of a fundamental reorganization of society on a planetary scale, not even society, of civilization, of human civilization.
I fully agree with that.
Yeah. Now, one question I have around this is in this pulse wave theory or wave pulse theory of history, what role do you see technology playing?
Yes. Well, so I know this may sound contradictory and maybe not what your audience wants to hear, but I think technology is not primary. Technology is not neutral either. It's the result of a particular form of society, which then chooses particular forms of technology that fit with its ideals and priorities.
I love it because it is exactly the opposite of my point of view. Just polar opposite of my point of view, where I exactly say the same words in the reverse order. What I say is that technology causes society to adopt a given shape. So let's look at this a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm just going to first acknowledge the relative truth of what you're saying, which is, of course, technology has a certain autonomy. But I want to give you a very concrete example so that people understand what I'm saying. So the internet, in my understanding, was actually started by military research. And it was the non-commissioned officers who said to their bosses, if there's war, nuclear war, we can't communicate with you. So you have to make sure that we can communicate amongst each other about, the surviving pockets in a nuclear war. And so that was the beginning. And then as they started to do that with DARPA, some scientists heard about it, and they actually started to pull cables from those projects. And so you see what I mean? So there was another group of civil scientists which then started using the technology. And by the time that I was discovering the internet in the late 80s and the early 90s, that was actually the case. So it was a scientific thing, and it had a scientific ideology, right? And then came the web, and suddenly people from the outside, citizens, could start using the internet. And then suddenly, because all these people were there, business was saying, we can make money there. And then so we had the Web 2.0, which was kind of the business takeover. And then third, the governments were saying, oh, something is happening that we need, we can't lose control of this. So what I'm saying is that if you look at the internet, it's a layered thing. It's not one group that dominates everything all the time, but it is, these different groups will think differently, and then they will design. So the original peer-to-peer design, which was, exactly designed to avoid control, once you got Facebook and YouTube and private owners that want to control and create scarcity to make a market, well, they're going to do client server and centralized servers. And so that's what I'm trying to say. So technology is not some magical thing that works on its own. It's also driven by ideals, interests, etc. And so what I'm trying to say is that if we change the structure of society, we will also very much likely think differently about technology. So the example I gave in the beginning of our talk was how these libertarian developers, which are at the same time pro-market but also very much pro-equality, they kind of combine these things. And I'm not in agreement with the libertarian ideology myself, but I respect them, and I find it interesting what they're doing. So that when they're free and they have the money, which they now have because of the crypto, well, what are they doing? They're creating decentralized structures again, right? But what they're not is they're actually hardly ecologically conscious. This is not a particular, ecologically conscious group, so they don't really care about nature. But if we can have a projects, and I might give you an example. This is one of the projects that I really like. It's called, so it's R3.0, Reporting 3.0. And they have this thing which is called the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council. Okay, so what does it mean? It's what they want to do, and they already have funding for this, so they're doing it experimentally, is set up a group of scientists who just monitor the availability of natural resources. So how much copper is there in the world? What's the biocircularity of copper? So I think it's about 70% if you reuse it. Yeah, you're very fast. And So imagine that you have this, and then you can actually pull it downward into shared distributed ledgers. Yeah. So I published a report last year, which is called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival, which looks at all the innovations in forms of new accounting. So we have contributory accounting. Contributory accounting is what open source communities do when they want to recognize contributions that are not recognized by the market. So they say, okay, we're working together on this, but the market only recognizes this little part of what we're doing. So we're going to redistribute internally, according different criteria, the income that we are generating. The second form of accounting, which is emerging right now, is called flow accounting. REA, resources, events, agents. And this is a post-capitalist, because there's no double entry, that immediately works for ecosystems. So instead of having a view of the world where what comes in my entity and goes out in my entity, and you don't see any externalities or the ecosystem, suddenly you have every transaction tells you exactly where you are in the network, right? And then the third form is what I call thermodynamic accounting. So you'd have access to these global thresholds and allocations at all the levels that you need to have. So this is called context-based sustainability, I think. And so you're a region, a bioregion, you're a local co-op, or even a corporation, and you would actually also know what you can do within planetary boundaries. So how can we provision for human needs without exceeding planetary boundaries? So technically, this is possible. This is actually already, there's various accounting systems that working on this, but what is missing is the interest of the elites with investment to be interested in this at this stage of history, right? But you see the idea, once if you would reform the world and society as if nature matters, as if the commons matters, then the kind of technology you would look to would not be the same kind of technology as we look for today. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the interplay between what is possible, what is desirable, what gets realized because the right kind of incentives are there, is a very rich interplay where, of course, we never are smart enough to find the perfect solution to these complex systems. Both in our personal lives, we make compromises that diminish our state of health or personal satisfaction. Our greed and selfishness collide with our desire to empathize with the plight of others. The nation states today dominating the regulatory environment that is the basis of the economic and social incentives that form societies are themselves both myopic and aspire to be the moral leaders and examples both for their citizens and for the rest of the world in a proud patriotism that is really not justified in practically any occasion and any case. And the accounting approach is pretty interesting because, of course, the way that we are accounting for value, basically, and decide whether value is being created or destroyed, is indeed something that is not a natural law, unless we are looking at it from a basic Darwinian point of view.
This is what we call the value regime, right? We decided in the 17th century that the only value we would recognize in our type of society would be scarce commodity value, whether it's a thing or labor power. So that's kind of what rules the logic of what is value, what is not value. And I think what we need, and what is already happening in my view, is a contributory regime. not a commodity regime, but a contributory regime. So if you look at work, this is a book that I'm actually reading right now, which I really recommend. It's Jason Moore, Capitalism and the Web of Life, right? And he talks about the way that capitalism works in two different things at the same time. So one is what he calls the commodity circuit, which is buying and selling things and becoming more competitive in this sphere. But the other thing was what he called the appropriation of nature, that we're always finding new things to take out of the earth. Exactly. Wow. And I mean, this is a dream what I'm seeing with your conversation. I've always dreamt of having somebody doing this, and you're doing it. This is fantastic. And so what communities are discovering is that once you start working in terms of peer production, which means you have an open and free system where people can freely add their contributions or not, like in open source production, in urban commons, etc. So once you have that thing emerging in the world because of our technology, so then I'm agreeing with you here that technology made something possible. So then the issue is, how can we have fairness in our communities? And so then what you do is you switch to a contributory regime. So we want to recognize all the value which enriches our commons. And so what people are doing is a bit what monasteries were doing in, very early on, which is you create a boundary between the external society and the internal society. And so all the income that comes from the outside is refiltered in a different way internally. And so a lot of, crypto communities and urban commons communities are doing exactly that. They're deciding themselves how they will spread the wealth in their own context, and they're becoming autonomous in doing this using new types of tools. This is what I call contributory accounting, but also it's connected with intelligent cryptocurrencies. And I'm sure you're familiar with Arthur Brock, who says it's not currency, it's current.cs. So in other words, what we have to do in a network society is to develop the ability to see the streams and the flows. And that's the problem today. Is a nation state cannot do that. A nation state, sees fixed things in their territory, and this is maybe half what is happening. The other half is invisible to them, which are all the flows of knowledge and wealth sharing that are now happening through these internetworks. And this is where I see the problem today, is that we don't have institutions that take care of this new layer. And so the old layer is no longer fully capable of dealing with the challenges that are now meta-local and, at a level where the nation state is not fully able to respond.
And we see that in many different ways. On one hand, the real state of panic at the emergence of global digital currencies, where the nation state believes that if they lose control, the world is going to end, and they don't understand that it is an evolutionary phase, that they did have control for a while. In the Middle Ages, there was no central bank controlling the monetary system, and why there should be in the 21st century, maybe in the second half. There is no natural law saying that. Another clear demonstration is, of course, the pandemic itself, where basically no nation has been able to put in place the measures that would manage the pandemic in a manner that fulfilled their mission of protecting the citizens, of giving a basis for thriving economically and organizationally, etc. And of course, the most important, I think, example of the nation state having run its course is how the Paris Accord over our climate and the desire of maintaining a climate that is suitable for biological human life is something that somebody can just say, oh, you know what, I'm opting out.
I'm less sure of this as what you just said. So obviously, you know, what I said, and you obviously agree with this, is that the nation state is not capable of doing a certain number of things. And so what we need is not more international. We also need transnational and translocal. But I don't think we have anything right now that can replace the functional role of the state. So this is where I'm not a libertarian, I'm not an anarchist. I actually believe that we need institutions for the common good at the territorial level. And so what we see today, but I think it will fail, it might bring some advantages. We actually see a revival of the nation state, right? And I would argue slightly differently than what you said about COVID, because COVID shows this, in my view, and it shows the opposite of what you said, in my view, which is, you know, I live in a country where there only have been 53 people who died from COVID. And you look at Taiwan, you look at Hong Kong, you look at Singapore, even Korea, where, you know, you said it was the second one. They've all succeeded actually in, you know, so we are the level of mortality which is 200 times smaller, relatively speaking, than the European and especially the neoliberal Anglo-Saxon countries. If you look at the countries who completely fail, it's the US, it's England, it's Brazil, right? And so these are particularly like nihilistic, you know, so-called populists, because they actually don't do anything for the people. And on the contrary, I mean, this is, you know, my progressive friends might not appreciate what I'm saying here, but, you know, you look at Poland and Hungary. I just read a study where it said that the bottom third of population was best off in Europe at this moment in Hungary and Poland, because these regimes, they're on the right, they're, you know, relatively xenophobic, and I don't support that. But what they're doing is they're actually taking care of their population in terms of, like, you know, if you have 4 kids in Hungary, you actually have like a basic income for the rest of your life.
Some would say they are buying votes.
Yeah, but that's what politics is about. It's about creating coalitions. So what you see is, you know, for me, the big mistake that Trump made, if you like, and, you know, I'm like absolutely not in that camp, but is that he didn't keep his promises. You know, he could have been much more clever as a, you know, right-wing populist, and, you know, protected the workers that he said he was going to protect, and he didn't.
Yeah.
So I think one of the ways that, you know, he's going to lose is because his kind of promises were really empty, and he's kind of a small, in my view, like just a predatory force.
And talking about that, one of the reasons why libertarian market-driven ideologies, in my opinion, are suboptimal is because they can only discover local maxima in the search for solutions. They don't have the ability to raise their gaze, look out on the broader horizon, and say, actually, we can aspire to something better. And similarly to biological evolution, they are lazy in grabbing the first and then sticking with it. And unless really forced by an existential threat.
But, you know, we need institutions. That's my point. So, you know, you mentioned the Middle Ages, which is, I'm kind of fascinated by these periods, and I'm a bit of a neo-medievalist in some ways, because, so if we look at the history, right, Rome was a centralized empire, right? What an empire does is it pacifies the territory in its control. So, you know, crime and violence enormously goes down inside the circle, and then it exports the violence to the exterior. And so when it collapsed, you know, you have centuries of strife. You know, the European history after the 5th century is like, you know, just endless wars between kingdoms and smaller territories. But when it settles down, you really have an example of a decentralized society. In the Middle Ages, I mean, you had feudalism. It wasn't based on territory; it was based on fealty, right? So a territory could be very distributed. But what held it together was actually the ideology of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And everything in the city was based on contracts. So it's kind of the ideal libertarian situation existed at the time. Everything was based on contracts. Everything was based on privileges. And these privileges were based on the strength that you could exert vis-a-vis the other forces. And I'm not saying this is an ideal situation at all, but if you look from the 11th to the 14th century, it was pretty well functioning, high level of civilization in Western Europe. And then in the 16th century, it became nation or centralized corporation, nation states again. And I think now we're moving back to the idea, and this is with wave-pulse theory, right? You have a polarity, centralization. That collapses, you have distribution. When that collapses, people think, oh, we need to centralize. So we went to centralize. And now that we see that centralization is not working, people are dreaming of distribution and decentralization. This is what the libertarian moment represents, is this kind of utopia that, since centralization doesn't seem to work, we have to go towards this decentralization. And I think what we need to do is more about hybrid forms. So the current system I would characterize as capital, state, nation. It's driven by capital. The state is at the service of capital. And then we have the nation, which is kind of the communal aspect of our societies, that, we have solidarity within the nation. What I'm suggesting is the commons is at the core. Around the commons, you have regenerative market entities, so that are not extractive and not degradative, but actually regenerative vis-a-vis the commons. And so I call it entrepreneurial rather than entrepreneurial, because the etymological root of entrepreneurs means taking in between. And so the idea that I have is, can we develop business forms around these commons, these shared resources we all depend on, that can actually enrich the community and the natural resource base, right? So rethink corporations and co-ops in a regenerative sense. And as you spoke about accounting and incentives, I just want to mention one project which I also think is very interesting, which is the economy for the common good. So this is Christian Felber, and it's a whole movement in Europe with 10,000 members and 2,000 organizations that practice it already. So he looked at all the European constitutions, and what he found was the following. All the European constitutions say that the economy should serve the common good. So there is nothing in the constitution which says that the economy should serve a private corporation. So he says, well, if we believe that the common good is not just metaphysical, we actually can find agreements between people where 96% of the people will agree that this is what the common good represents. And so they did that exercise and then arrived at 17 clusters of impact. And so I call this outside-in incentives, because what you could do is, as a state, as a region, you could say, okay, we have an investment in creative economy, for example. Well, we will support more those entities that have good impact overall. And we will support less those entities that have very low positive impact, right? So you'd still have cooperation, you still have cooperatives, but the logic of their operation would have to conform to societal priorities. And so you'd still have a CAO, but if he has to be positive on those impacts, it's not going to be the same type of CAO that we have now, right? So what you're doing is you're using these incentives outside to force an adaptation inside these entities. I think this is a very fruitful way of thinking, and I hope this is the kind of thing we will be experimenting with.
You mentioned an interesting expression when you described the situation of crypto practitioners in Chiang Mai at the beginning of our conversation. You labeled them as the labor aristocracy.
Aristocracy, yeah.
And the reason why it struck me as an expression is because one of the forces of technology as it evolves is to democratize access to certain functions and certain ways of being that were extremely elitary at the beginning, and then they become accessible to everyone. One of the examples is the mobile phone that was very expensive to be a symbol of UP success in New York in the 90s, as you were laying on your Ferrari and you were frying your brain with a brick that cost $15,000 to buy, and it lasted 10 minutes of conversation, but everyone was admiring you and how successful Wall Street trader you were, or whatever the ideal was at the time. And today, literally everyone has a phone, including poor farmers in Thailand or fishermen in Indonesia who are emancipating themselves thanks to the democratizing force of mobile communications. So with respect to the future of work and labor, one of the common threads today, which I think is profoundly misplaced and misunderstands the role of technology, is the fear of artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation. Because the common assumption is that that labor is a finite entity, the finite volume of work is available. So if robots take it, there will be less left for people to do. And instead, I believe that what we are seeing through crypto in Chiang Mai is just the beginning of a transition where, with the help, not because it destroys or attacks, but with the support and help of AI and automation, increasing numbers of people, hopefully everyone sooner or later, is going to be able to participate in a kind of new way of existing, where your passions and talents and aspirations are the primary driver of what you do, and not the economic incentive.
Yes, so I want to say something very important about this, and I want to take a historical analogy. So in the 16th century started what we call the process of enclosures, right? This is where, so in the medieval peasants had their own little plot of land, then they had the land of the Lord, they had to work on it and give half away. And then they had common land. This is where the word commons comes from. So there were areas where all the people in the village could, graze their cows and take herbs, and so this was called the commons. And so this was enclosed and privatized in the 17th century, maybe a bit before. And so all these people were chased away of the land and arrived in the cities and became labor and the working class, right? But what you shouldn't forget is that if you look at 1840 in UK, the average worker lived around 31, 32 years old. Whereas a farmer lived like 55, I was listening to a podcast where this French historian was saying, so this is in 1830, 10,000 miners in Lille in the northern France, or I don't know how many, I think, but they had 10,000 kids. That's the thing, 10,000 kids. They didn't even have housing. They lived in caves. And 10 years later, only 600 kids were still alive, right? So what I'm saying is, so the positive side of looking at what you just said is that what technology does, it frees resources, right? Because all these people no longer have to work in the countryside, because those people no longer have to work in factories or offices. What it does, it frees an enormous amount of human energy to do something else. This is the positive side. So I'm like you. I don't believe that AI in itself is the issue, but there's some other issues, which is that this AI is owned by private corporations, don't feel responsible for the results of this. And right now, the social movements are very weak, and so this is what is happening. And COVID has accelerated this. We're facing a very fast impoverishment of middle classes and working classes in the Western world and elsewhere. But this is, you see the economic consequences of COVID. This is going to be a very rapid acceleration of a downward trend. And my view is that's why we need politics. So we need to find redistribution mechanisms, and that's why actually a lot of CEOs in Silicon Valley actually agree with this, right? That's why they talk about the basic income, because within capitalism, I'm sorry to say, if you become very productive and you make a lot of profit, but if nobody can buy your products, it's your problem too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what I kind of, my reproach to the classic left is that they're stuck in their Keynesian welfare state vision, and they just dream of recreating, the 60s and the 70s. And I think we need something else which recognizes also the positive side. And the positive side of technology is what we've been talking about. We now have a class of people, highly educated, with ideals, and they want to do passionate and meaningful work. And they can do so in a way which is no longer fit within the classic idea of a job. So it's not a distribution of labor, it's a distribution of tasks. And I'm sure you and I, we work that way, right? We do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But what brings it all together is that we have a vision of where we're going. And so our little tasks, we know where it's going, but it's not a job. I don't know, maybe you're different, but I don't have a job, right?
Well, yeah, that's
And
right.
so what we need to find, what we need to find is a system of social solidarity which fits that new situation. And so I give you one example which I like. So I work I had a 3-year contract with smart.coop. And this is a really interesting system which I want to briefly explain how it works. So as a freelancer, I become a member of the co-op, and they will take care of my invoicing, and they will charge 4.5%. This is called a factoring fee, but because it's a co-op, this factoring fee will then fund the co-op and all the services that they can develop for the membership. The next step is, after 6 months, they have an algorithm that calculates how much you can pay yourself on a regular basis. So then you have two accounts, your accounts where all your money coming from your clients, and then you pay yourself a salary. And so what they're doing is they create a salary for freelancers, and they connect with the social welfare system in Belgium. And so even though I'm a freelancer and I have the full freedom of choosing my clients, I'm also protected. I have unemployment, I have free medication, free education. So this is, I think, a very ingenious hack, and they call it autonomous workers. So, using the best of the old system without destroying the freedom of the new.
You mentioned that you mentioned politicians and politics and policies. I don't want to ask whether we see the kind of leadership, both the ability of corralling consensus and the thought leadership of articulating inspiring visions of the future, because I don't believe we see either of those. And maybe you can provide examples to the contrary, but I'm not aware of them. How are we going to adopt the new system? When Churchill quipped that democracy is the worst kind of government except every other kind, we thought he was joking, but he launched a challenge that for the past 70, 80 years, nobody had the courage of taking on in order to design and to popularize an alternative system strong enough for it to be adopted. So how are we going to get there?
So my strategy is the following. So we have to start by strengthening the autonomous sphere of globally inter-networked commons. So this, if you create an open source project or you create an urban commons, which is more local, so you create, first of all, the commons itself, which is an open, productive, contributory community. Then you think, okay, how are we going to fund this and how are we going to make a living of this? And so what you do is you start creating generative economic entities. And so this creates an economy around the commons, but a generative economy around the commons. What they also do is they create new institutions to manage the infrastructure of cooperation. So I call these for benefit associations. So typically, if you look at open source, you see the community of contributors, you see the companies working around the open source software, but you also see the Linux Foundation, the Drupal Association, etc., right? So this is, for me, like a seed form of a new potential new form of economy. So the only thing that happens in open source is that the companies that work with open source are rarely generative. They usually are, normal private companies. But so I've proposed things like the copy fair license. So you have an entity that has to make a living around this shared resource, and you want to have a generative economy. So how would you create that? The problem that I see with classic open source copyleft is that, and I know this sounds provocative to an American audience, but I'll say it anyway, they're communist licenses. Everybody can contribute and everybody can use, including the big companies, right? And it seems to work for free software, but it's very problematic once you start producing material things, because you're going to be a co-op, you're going to be investing in open hardware, and then before you know it, some big company steals everything, and you don't have the financing to survive. So what is reciprocity copy fair? It's we keep the knowledge flowing as in open source, but we make commercialization conditional on reciprocity. So what I want to do is to create entrepreneurial coalitions of entities that work with and for the commons, that are both commercial because they want to create livelihoods, but they also want to maintain the commons they depend on. And then you look at the world of capital, and here what I propose is what I call reverse cooptation. And the word I use, which is not for me, but it's transvestment. So investment is using capital to obtain more capital, and transvestment is using capital to create more commons. So there is a value transfer from one system to another. So the first time I heard about this was Lumio from Inspiral in New Zealand, where they had an investment for Lumio, but they guaranteed that Lumio would stay open source. They paid off the investment 5% a year, but after 10 years, they basically thanked the investor, but they have strengthened their open source product in what they feel is a non-exploitative way. So this is what I'm looking at. So imagine a new autonomous sphere, relatively autonomous sphere of commons-oriented peer production that is growing bit by bit in your society. And then the next step is, and this is where we might not agree with each other, but I think this is still essential, is how do you get political support? Because there's a whole regulatory regime that is designed for another purpose. And I think at this stage, it's the local level. So I see urban entities, cities, working together to create what I call global open design depositories or protocol co-ops. So what is a protocol co-op? Let's say you want to do something like Airbnb or Uber, but in a less extractive way, right? So instead of just regulating Airbnb, which is actually, maybe you follow this. This is happening now on scale with COVID. That cities are taking back control and creating regulations against both. But what I want is more a positive thing. Is okay. Let's do fair BNB. Let's do money right? Exactly. And so with that, you then create a coalition of cities allied with ethical finance, with generative finance, with impact finance, allied with these local communities, and you make these open depositories which can be used everywhere in the world. So what you have is a global governance model, which is translocal, transnational, but is not an emanation of the nation state. You bypass the nation state and you've created something that is translocal, transnational, but still has governance. It still has, kind of city power behind it, and that's what I see as the strategy.
And of course, it will be fascinating to see how these experiments play out, especially where the nation state is going to realize how important they are, and it will want to exert control over them. But exactly because they have become important and powerful, that control may not be possible in a way.
You have to see it like the guilds in the Middle Ages, right? So the guilds in the Middle Ages, are strong enough to make deals with the counts and the dukes and the kings. And for about 3 centuries, they self-managed their cities. A medieval city was a commune, was the name they used. And it was a free commune because the guilds, a coalition of guilds, managed the local affairs in agreements with the church and the king, and they were powerful enough to defend the freedoms of their, they were based on charters, right? And that's, there's no way around it. If we're not powerful, we won't get anywhere. And this is my critique on the more utopian, purely horizontalist movements within the commons who think, if we just talk together and create assemblies and no, I think we need to really engage with the institutional world and create a form of power where this vision of the world can also then be advancing. At this stage, I don't think we're strong enough to do anything at the nation state, but I think we're already strong enough because we have a tenfold increase in urban commons in Europe in 10 years, right? So, okay, it's only 2 or 3% of the population, but 2 or 3% of the population can already make a difference.
And especially if the trend keeps going, it will further multiply, not linearly, but exponentially.
See what happens with COVID. With COVID, what we see is so if you look at complex adaptive systems, so they have a stable period, and then they start fragmenting and disassembling, and that's what we're living now, right? The BLM movement, the COVID, all of these things are signs that the old system is disintegrating, and that's not a pleasant process. But at the same time, this creates room where people say, oh, we have to do things differently. So they start experimenting more. They start looking for alternatives more. And so in that sense, if you look at it from the point of view of the imaginal cells, the cells in the caterpillar, which are going to become the butterfly, then you don't see the chaos. You see the possibilities of creating the successor system, right?
Yeah.
And that's why people like me, we try to keep our optimism, because we look not just at things that are going wrong right now, but we look at the vision that inspires us to continue working and to make a more successful transition. And I fully agree with you. We can be utopian in this. There's no guarantee we will succeed. But I'm going to make a deal with you, like a wager. I bet that not 100% of humanity is going to die, right? And And so then,
who the universe really care about it, because we are not seeing other technological civilizations, and we are asking ourselves, why is that? Where is the great filter? What is stopping our curiosity and exploration from swarming out? So I really want to be on the same side of the wager with you, so that the transition.
We want to be there to see who's won the wager.
Michel, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I thank you very much for sharing your ideas and wisdom with our viewers and listeners. And I hope to have you back on Searching for the Question live soon.
Thank you so much. It was very pleasant and very, stimulating questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you very much, everyone, for watching Searching for the Question live. You can suggest new guests and vote on the guests suggested by others coming to the URL that you see on the screen. I also have an Italian YouTube channel. If you go to davidorban.com/YouTube Italiano, you can subscribe to that. And as before, if you like the content that together with my team I create, please become a fan, a supporter, a sponsor, or a benefactor on patreon.com/David Orban. So thank you very much, and I will see you at the next episode of Searching for the Question Live.